The flare hung in the air over Relay Station Cygnus 9, like a coal somebody had thrown and forgotten to let fall. Mara Vance had seen a lot of impossible things in 11 years of service, but nothing prepared her for a flare that didn't drop. It sat there above the gantry, a smear of magnesium white frozen mid-arc, its light not flickering so much as held, the way a held note hangs off the end of a piano string before the damper comes down. Rain hung with it, 10,000 beads of it, motionless, each one catching the dead flare and throwing it back, so that the whole sky over the station looked like a shattered windshield lit from inside. She knew what it meant. Everyone on the spindle knew what it meant, in the way you know a thing in your spine before your head catches up. The Celt had dropped the lattice. Time had stopped for everyone who wasn't already dead, and the dying would take a long, long time about it. Vance. Sergeant Oyalaran's voice came thin through the helmet, already half frozen out of the air. Vance, you reading the field? I'm reading it. Then you know what comes next. She did. She just didn't want to be the one to say it. Below her, on the loading floor, Corporal Imani Sese was caught in the act of falling. A Celt bus had taken her in the hip, and she'd been going down when the lattice came, and now she would go down forever, or until the field lifted, whichever came first. Except the field didn't lift. That was the thing about the Celt. The field never lifted. They put you in the stillness, and then they walked through it at their own slow glacial pace, sorting the living from the dead. And there was nothing you could do because you weren't moving. Nobody moved inside a lattice. That was the whole point of it. That was why 30 worlds had fallen, and not one of them had managed to get a warning out. Mara looked at her hands. They were shaking. They always shook before a performance. Mother used to fold them between her own and say, "The shake is just the music asking to get out. Mija, you let it out, and it stops." She'd been 6. She'd believed it. 40 years later, she still half believed it. And that was the only reason her thumb found the injector tab on her forearm without her having to look. Command says play it, Oyalaran said. Command says you and Reyes are the only two with the tuning to do it. Command says. I heard what Command says. Mara. It was the first time the sergeant had used her name. There's no other relay in range. The fleet comes through the Halsey corridor in 90 hours. And they don't know the Celt are sitting in it. 40,000 people. They fly in blind. The Celt freeze the whole formation and take it apart at their leisure, the way they did at Tannhauser. You get a signal out, they reroute. You don't, they don't. I know the math. Then you know it's worth 3 minutes. That was the joke nobody on the spindle said out loud. 3 minutes. That was what the quick gave you. More or less. Before your nervous system cooked itself, trying to run at a speed flesh was never built to run at. Some people got 4. Some people got 90 seconds and a brain like a burst fruit. The chem boys called it tempo on the bottle, and the grunts called it redline, and everybody who'd ever watched a friend take it called it the same thing in their own head. The thing you don't say. You burned 3 minutes off the front of your life to buy 3 minutes inside the stillness where the world stood still. And you, for one terrible window, did not. She thumbed the tab. The injector kicked her like a small animal. For a second, nothing. Then the cold came up her arm and into her chest and behind her eyes, and the world, the frozen, beautiful, ruined world, exhaled. The flare fell. Not fast. That was the thing nobody could explain to you before your first time. The thing that made veterans go quiet when the new ones asked. The flare didn't snap back into motion. It crept. It drifted down through the held rain at the pace of honey off a spoon, and the rain beads themselves began the slow business of sliding earthward, and the magnesium light bled from white toward gold, so gradually you could watch the color travel. The whole frozen world hadn't stopped. It had only slowed, relative to her, and now that she was running at 1,000 times its tempo, she could see it for what it was. Not a photograph, but the slowest film ever shot. Every drop a story, every spark a saga. She breathed, and the breath roared in her ears like surf. Please. Her own voice sounded wrong, low and dragging. The helmet mic recording at the world's speed, her words coming out of her mouth at hers. She had to slow herself, force the syllables out at a crawl, to make a sound the recording could even hold. Dane. You up? A long pause. Then his voice equally slow, equally wrong, equally moving up. God, up. You ever get used to this? Good. I'd hate to be the only one. She found him on the comms deck 2 flights down, and the going down was its own small horror, because the stairs were full of people. The whole second platoon had been falling back when the lattice took them. And now they stood like a museum of the instant of their fear. Tomas, with his mouth open, mid-shout, Briggs with one boot off the deck, the medic Anwar, reaching for a wound that would still be bleeding when she came back, if she came back. Mara went through them the way you go through a crowd of statues that used to be your friends. She did not touch them. Touching a frozen body at speed was a way to break your own hand. The mass of them at the world's tempo was effectively immovable, a wall of warm stone. You learned that the way you learned everything in the stillness, by watching someone learn it badly. Dane Reyes was sitting at the relay console, with blood already starting at his left nostril, a single bead of it hanging off his lip like the rain outside. He'd dosed 30 seconds before she had. She could see it in the slackness around his eyes, the way Redline ate at you. He was a comms officer, not an engineer. His job in the next 3 minutes was to feed the message and to keep the timing, and her job was to play. That was the division. He spoke. She made the instrument speak. "How's the lattice?" she asked. He turned the readout toward her, without a word. The Kelt field wrapped the spindle in a lattice of standing temporal waves, a cage made of frozen seconds, and to push a signal out of it, you couldn't just transmit. The lattice ate transmissions. It slowed them until they died. You could do what some half-mad theorist back at Pavonis had worked out, and nobody had ever lived to test, was to the lattice's own resonance. Find the standing waves, and thread a pulse through the gaps faster than the field could close them. Find the gaps, thread the pulse. 312 of them in sequence. In the right order. Each one open for a fraction of a second, even at her sped-up perception. And miss one, and the whole thing collapsed and you started over, if you had the time, which you would not. It was, in other words, a piece of music. Terrible, alien, lethal piece of music, 312 notes long, that had to be played perfectly at a speed no Kelt had ever imagined a living thing could reach, on a console that was never built to be played. Mara flexed her fingers. The console keys were too far apart and too stiff and laid out for a technician's slow, deliberate poking, not for a player. She'd modded it herself in the 11 hours since Command had told her what they wanted, pulling the key guards, loosening the action, until under her hands it felt less like a machine and more like the worst piano ever made. She'd cried a little doing it. She hadn't told anyone that. "Score's loaded," Dane said. "You want to look at it?" "No. If I look at it, I'll start thinking. Call the gaps." "Mara." "What?" He wiped the blood off his lip with the back of his glove and looked at it, that bright human red, the only fast-moving thing in a frozen world besides the two of them. "We've got 3 minutes. The play takes most of it. There's no second run. If your hands are shaking..." "My hands are always shaking." She sat. Chair was wrong too, but you played the piano you were given. "It's the music asking to get out." He almost smiled. "That a real thing pianists say?" "It's a thing my mother said." She set her fingers over the keys, 10 of them, hovering, and felt the old animal certainty come up through her wrists, the way it had come through them 10,000 times in 10,000 practice rooms when she was a girl, with a metronome, and a mother who would not let her stop. "Call the first gap. Stand by." He bent to the readout. Outside the viewport, the flare had fallen perhaps a meter. The rain had moved perhaps a handspan. They had all the time in the world, which is to say they had 3 minutes. First gap, in, mark. And Mara Vance, who had once been told by 3 examiners in a wood-paneled room on a planet that no longer existed that she had the finest hands of her conservatory year and would never amount to anything because she lacked the soul to use them. Mara Vance began to play. First note went out clean. She felt it more than saw it. The pulse threading the gap a hair before the gap closed. The lattice swallowing where it should have, and finding nothing there. The readout flickered green. "1 good," Dane breathed. Next in 3, 2, 2, 3. The intervals were inhuman, the spacing dictated by the alien physics of the field, and not by any music a human had ever written. And that was the thing that would have stopped most players cold. There was no rhythm to lean on, no pulse, no time signature your body could trust. You couldn't feel where the next note went. You could only be told, note by note, by a man with a nosebleed reading numbers off a screen. And you had to put your finger down at exactly the instant he said, and not a hair before or after, 312 times. Here is the thing the examiners had been wrong about. The thing the Celt did not know. The thing 40,000 soldiers asleep in cold sleep, on the far side of the Halsey corridor, were trusting their lives to without knowing they were trusting it to anyone at all. A human hand, trained from childhood, does not need to understand the music to play it. It only needs to be told where to go, and to have spent 40 years learning to go there, without flinching. The soul the examiners wanted, the thing they said she lacked, she had never had it the way they meant. What she had instead was the discipline of a child who had practiced scales until her fingers bled, and then practiced them again because her mother had sat beside her and hummed and would not let her stop. That discipline did not care about soul. That discipline cared about the next note and only the next note, world without end. 12 notes in. The blood started at her own nose now, and she let it. 20 outside, a Celt was coming. She saw it through the viewport, between notes, in the slivers of attention she could spare. It came across the loading floor, toward Imani's frozen falling body at a pace that, to the frozen world, would have looked like terrible speed, and to Mara looked like a glacier, remembering an old grievance. The Celt did not walk. It was wrong to say they walked. They were tall and segmented and the color of old ice, and they moved by a slow rippling of their lower mass, and where a human face would be, they had instead a cluster of slow flat plates that turned and refocused like the petals of a flower made of stone. Perceived time the way humans perceived space. Broadly, at leisure, a whole landscape of it spread out before them to stroll through. A second to a Celt was a country. They lived their long lives in the gaps between the moments where fast little creatures like Mara burned themselves out, and they had conquered 30 worlds by the simple expedient of stopping time and then taking everything in it apart slowly enough to enjoy, and not one fast little creature had ever moved inside the stillness while they did it. The Celt reached Imani's body. It bent its slow stone flower toward her. Mara understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the red line, that it was deciding, sorting the corporal into the living or the dead, and that whichever it decided it would take a small, slow eternity to act on, and that there was nothing Mara could do about any of it. Notes 45. Her job was the next note. Mother's voice from 40 years and a dead planet away. The next note, Mija, not the song. The note. You're slowing, Dane said. His voice had gone strange, the words slurring at the edges. The red line ate at the speech centers first in some people. Gap in 2-2, she caught it. 50 notes. It was somewhere around its note 70 that she felt Dane's hand on her shoulder. And that was so far outside the rules of the thing that she nearly missed a gap. You did not touch a player. You especially did not touch a player when the player was threading 312 impossible notes through an alien cage with both their lives and 40,000 others riding on it. She kept her hands moving and turned her head a fraction and saw his face and understood. He was out of message to feed. He'd loaded the whole thing into the relay's buffer in the first 10 seconds, the way a comms officer would. The score he was reading off the screen was automatic now. There was, for a stretch of the middle of the piece, nothing for him to do but call gaps and bleed, and he had used some sliver of that nothing, some fraction of a second of the 3 minutes he was burning off the front of his own life, to put his hand on her shoulder, not to steady her. She didn't need steadying, to be there, because they were the only two warm, fast things in a world of frozen stone, and he had decided, in the cold arithmetic of a dying man's 3 minutes, that it was worth a quarter second to not do it alone. The Celt's flower face turned. She saw it happen between notes 80 and 81. The thing's slow attention swiveled off Imani's body and toward the comms deck, toward the viewport, toward the two impossible flickers of fast-on warm motion that should not, could not, had never once in 30 conquered worlds existed inside a lattice. Plates of its face refocused. It had noticed them. It had no framework for them. Mara understood this in her gut the way she understood music, below language. And so it did the thing a Celt did with an anomaly, which was to study it slowly, the way you'd study an insect doing something an insect shouldn't. Sees us, Dane said. It sees something. 85. It doesn't know what. Does that help? It buys us the song. 90. It thinks we're a malfunction. It's going to watch us malfunction for as long as it takes to be sure. 3 minutes it isn't spending killing Imani. And here was the second thing the Celt did not know. The thing that had nothing to do with hands or discipline. The thing that lived in the quarter-second of Dane Reyes's glove, on her shoulder. Celt had a model for everything Fast Life did. Because everything Fast Life did was, to them, predictable. Fast Life ran. Fast Life fought. Fast Life optimized. Fast Life spent every borrowed second on advantage, because that was what you did with borrowed time. The Celt could account for a creature that overclocked itself to escape, to attack, to survive. What the Celt could not account for. What broke its slow study. What kept its stone flower turning and turning, trying to resolve the anomaly, was the hand on the shoulder. It could see that one of the fast flickers had spent a fraction of its precious borrowed acceleration, not on advantage, not on the task, not on survival, but on touching the other one, for no reason the Celt could compute. The Celt's whole long, cold civilization had no slot for that, and so it watched and tried to understand, and did not act, and the song went on. There was a stretch in the dead middle of the piece. She'd marked it in her head the one time she'd let herself look at the score, where the gaps came far enough apart that a hand could rest for the space of a breath between them. Not long, at her tempo, a breath, but long enough that on note 110 she let her left hand fall into her lap for the half-second it had. And Dane, who had nothing to feed, and nothing to do but call gaps and bleed, reached down without a word and put something cold and metal in it. She knew the shape of it before she looked. A flask. Battered aluminum, the cap on a little chain, the kind every old soldier carried and pretended was for medicinal use. She'd seen it 100 times in the mess, passed down the table on bad nights. Dane swearing it was his grandfather's, and everyone it was rotgut he'd bought on the supply run. She couldn't drink. There was no time to drink, and the red line would have made it poison anyway, but he'd put it in her hand, in the dead middle of the worst performance of her life, the way you'd pass it down a table on a bad night, and that was the whole message. I'm here. We're here. This is still us. She closed her useless free hand around the cold metal for the length of one held breath, and then the gap came, and she gave it back, and her hand went up to the keys again. Outside the viewport the world went on, with its slow, enormous patience. She could see, if she let herself look, the whole frozen architecture of the last few seconds of the station's life. A man named Tomas, falling with his mouth open in a shout no one would ever hear finish, the medic Anwar's reaching hand a hair's breadth from a wound, a single spent cartridge case, turning end over end in the air above the loading floor, catching the dead flare's gold light on each slow rotation. It was beautiful, in the way that only terrible things held perfectly still can be beautiful. The Celt, she thought, must live their whole lives in this held golden, motionless world, this museum of instants. And that was why they could not understand the two fast, warm things flickering through it. To the Celt, the stillness was home. To Mara it was a held breath before the damper came down, and she had been trained since she was 6 years old to know that a held note is only beautiful because it ends. The Celt's flower face turned infinitely slow, tracking her. She wondered what she looked like to it. A smear. A flicker. A wrongness in the held world. Moving where nothing should move. Spending borrowed time on flasks and lullabies, and a hand laid in a lap. She hoped it was afraid. She suspected it wasn't. That fear, like the lullaby, was a thing too fast for it. A thing it had no slot for, and she found she pitied it a little. This slow, cold lord of frozen seconds who had conquered 30 worlds, and would never once in its long, glacial life know what it was to spend. A second it couldn't afford on someone it loved. 100 notes. Mara's vision had begun to gray at the edges. The red line did that, toward the end, narrowed you, the way a long performance narrows you, until there was nothing in the world but the keyboard and the next note and the next. She'd been here before. Not here, not in a frozen war with an alien glacier watching her bleed, but here, at the gray edge of a long piece, fingers screaming, the audience gone, the hall gone, everything gone, but the discipline that her mother had folded into her hands like a second set of bones. She let the gray come. She let everything go but the next note. She had been training for this her whole life, and had not known it. And the not knowing did not matter now, because the hands knew, and the hands did not stop. 140. Mother's tune surfaced in her, unbidden, the way it always had at Gray Edge. The little wordless lullaby the woman used to hum beside the practice bench. 3 notes up and 2 notes down. The most ordinary tune in the galaxy. The tune of a tired woman keeping a tired child company in the small hours of an impossible discipline. Mara did not play it. The score had no room for it. She hummed it, low, under the roar of her own slowed breath, and the humming steadied something in her chest that the red line had been pulling apart. And the next note went out clean. "What is that?" Dane said. His voice was very bad now. "What are you?" "My mother, 150. Used to hum it. While I practiced. It's nice." A long pause. Outside the flare fell another meter. "Sing it." "Shh." "The rest of the way." "I want to hear it." So she sang it, 3 notes up and 2 notes down, the most ordinary tune in the galaxy, while her trained and bleeding hands threaded a war out through the gaps in an alien cage. And the Celt watched, its stone flower turning, finding no slot for any of it. Not the hand on the shoulder, not the song with no purpose. Just not the 2 small, fast, warm creatures spending the front of their lives on a lullaby in the heart of the stillness. And the watching was the thing that gave them the time, and the time was the thing that let her play. 190, 200. The Celt, having watched long enough to be sure the anomaly was not resolving, began at last to do something about it. Mara saw raise one slow segmented limb toward the viewport, and at the end of the limb the air began to thicken, to granulate the way the air did just before a fresh lattice fell. The thing was going to drop a second, tighter freeze, right on top of them, fast enough even at its glacial speed to catch them before the song was done. Because 3 minutes is 3 minutes, and theirs was running out. "Tightening the field," Dane said. "Mara, it's going to lock us. How many left?" 110. Her own blood was in her mouth now, copper and warm. "Call the gaps faster." "There's no faster. The gaps are the gaps." "Then call them the same and I'll go faster." "You can't go faster than the gaps." "Watch me." This was the third thing the Celt did not know, and it was the simplest one, and it was the one the examiners had gotten exactly backwards 40 years ago in their wood-paneled room. They had told her she had the hands, and not the soul. They had meant it as a verdict, that she would be technically perfect and forever small, that she lacked the thing that made music matter, the willingness to risk the wrong note in service of the true one, the willingness to burn. They had been wrong about which one she lacked. She had always had the soul. What she had been protecting, all those years, behind the perfect technique, was the willingness to spend it, to play not safely but completely, to put everything she was into the instrument, and have nothing left when the last note died. She had never done it. She had been good and careful and small her whole life, and she had hated herself for it in the gray hours. And here, at the gray edge of the last performance she would ever give, she finally understood that the red line had given her the one gift the Celt could never give and never take. It had made carefulness pointless. There was no after to protect anymore. There were only the notes and the willingness to burn for them, and she had been saving that willingness for 40 years. And now she spent all of it at once. She stopped waiting for Dane to call the gaps. She had heard 200 of them now. She had felt where they fell, the alien arrhythmic pattern of them, the way you feel a piece in your hands after you've played the first 2/3 of it. Not as numbers, not as a score, but as a shape, a logic, a thing the body learns below the level of words. The examiners would have called it impossible. The Celt would have called it impossible. 200 data points of an alien temporal field were not enough to extrapolate the remaining 112. No instrument could do it. No computer in the systems could do it in the time remaining. But Mara Vance was not a computer. She was a 46-year-old woman with bleeding hands and a lullaby in her throat and the discipline of 10,000 practice rooms. And she did the thing that human hands do that no machine and no Celt and no examiner had ever once accounted for. She guessed. She felt where the next gap had to fall, the way you feel where a melody has to go. And she put her finger down a hair ahead of where the field expected any living thing to be. And the pulse threaded through, and the readout flickered green. You're ahead of the score, Dane whispered. Mara, you're ahead of the... I know where it goes. 220. Thickening air was a handspan from the viewport now. The second freeze almost on them. It's a song. I know where it goes. She played the last 90 notes by feel ahead of the screen, ahead of the gaps, ahead of the slow stone hand reaching to lock the world. Trained and dying hands moving at a speed that no flesh was built for, and no Celt had imagined, and no examiner had believed she had in her, and she hummed her mother's tune the whole way. 3 notes up and 2 notes down, and somewhere around note 270, she stopped, being afraid, because there was no room left in her for anything but the music. 290. The granulated air touched the viewport. Cold of the second freeze began to creep in at the edges of the room, slowing the rain that hung there, slowing the falling flare, slowing. She could feel it. The red line and the new field fighting over her nervous system like 2 dogs over a bone. 300. Dane's hand was on her shoulder again. She didn't look. She didn't have to. 305. The room was getting cold and slow and gray. And her hands were the last fast thing in the universe, and they did not stop. 310. 311. The last note was the hardest, because by then the second freeze had her halfway, and her hand had to travel a distance that the slowing field made feel like a mile, and the gap for it was the smallest of all, a sliver of a sliver, open for a breath and then gone forever. She felt where it was. She felt it the way she'd felt the resolution of every piece she'd ever played, the note the whole thing had been reaching for, the one that made the rest make sense. Finger came down. 312. The relay fired. She didn't hear it so much as feel it leave. A pulse threading the last gap a hair before the lattice and the new freeze closed over it together. A single tuned scream of data punching out through the cage and into the dark, toward a corridor 90 hours away, where 40,000 people slept in cold sleep, with no idea that 2 strangers had just spent the fronts of their lives to a single word in a language of frozen seconds, and the word was, Don't come this way. The Celt are here. Reroute and live and never know. The readout went white, and then the second freeze took her, and the world stopped, and Mara Vance stopped with it. She woke because the rain hit her face. That was how she knew it had worked. Before anything else. Before the medics, before the count of the dead, before any of it. The rain was falling. It came down out of a gray dawn sky onto the loading floor of Relay Station Cygnus 9, and it hit her face, cold and ordinary, and moving, and she lay on the deck where she'd fallen in a chair, and let it hit her, and understood that the lattice was gone. The Celt did not leave their fields running once a world was taken. They had left. The field had lifted, and a field only lifted when the Celt decided there was nothing left worth freezing, or when something had broken the lattice from inside, which had never happened, not in 30 worlds, not once, until the Philae fired its tuned scream through the cage, and the cage, designed to stop all known life, had cracked on the one thing its makers had never thought to account for. Hands didn't work. That was the red line's price, the part nobody put on the bottle. The fine motor was gone, maybe for good. The tendons and the nerves of 40 years training burned out in 3 minutes to buy a window. She looked at them lying useless in the falling rain, the finest hands of her conservatory year. And she found she could not even feel sad about it, because they had done the one thing she had been saving them for her whole life. And a thing that is finished does not need to be mourned the way a thing unfinished does. Dane, she said. Sergeant Oyalaran's face came into the rain above her, alive, moving, weeping in a way the sergeant would later deny. Easy, Vance, easy. Medics are on you. You did it. You hear me? The relay fired. Getting confirmation the fleet's rerouting. You did it. Dane, Mara said again. The sergeant's face did the thing that faces do. Mara closed her eyes and lay in the falling rain and understood that Dane Reyes had taken his dose 30 seconds before she'd taken hers, and that 30 seconds, at the front of a life, is everything, and that he had spent his last quarter second on a hand on her shoulder, and his last breath asking to hear a lullaby, and that he was somewhere on the comms deck above her now, frozen forever in the instant the red line took the last of him, except that nothing was frozen anymore, and so he was simply gone. She lay in the rain a long time. The medics let her. Somewhere far above in the gray dawn, A flare she had watched hang motionless for 3 impossible minutes finished the fall it had started, and guttered out on the wet deck, its work as done as hers. They wanted to give her things afterward, a medal which she let them pin on her ruined chest and never looked at again, a discharge which she signed with a pen held in a fist because her fingers would not close around it properly anymore, a speech to the fleet that her message had saved. 40,000 people who lived because 2 strangers played them a warning in a language of frozen seconds, and the brass wanted her to stand up in front of all of them. And something about humanity, about courage, about the indomitable spirit of a species that would not be stopped. She declined the speech. She didn't have one. She had never had the soul for that kind of thing. The examiners had been right about that much. The soul for the big declared moment, the victory speech, the thing that exists to be applauded, she'd had instead was the next note. She tried to explain this once to a young officer who'd come to interview her for the record, who wanted to know how it felt to be the only human being who had ever broken a Celt lattice from inside. How it felt to have done the impossible. Wasn't impossible, she said. That was the whole thing. They built the cage to stop everything fast life does. Fight, escape, everything that makes sense. They had a model for all of it. Her ruined hands lay in her lap, and she looked at them. They just never built it to stop a thing that doesn't make sense. A hand on a shoulder when there's no time for it. A song with no reason. A woman who's good and careful her whole life deciding for 3 minutes to stop being careful and just burn. She was quiet a while. The young officer waited. They'd told him to let her take her time. We're not faster than them. We're not stronger. We're not smarter. God, they think in centuries. We think in heartbeats. The only thing we ever had that they didn't is that we do things that don't make sense. We spend the time we don't have on the things that don't pay. And they can't model it. They watched us do it, and they couldn't look away because they couldn't understand it. And the not understanding is the gap we threaded the whole war through. The officer wrote it down. He got most of it wrong in the official record. Smoothed it into something about courage and the human spirit, the kind of thing that exists to be applauded. Mara didn't mind. She'd stopped caring about getting it right for other people. A long time ago, somewhere around note 70, with a dying man's hand on her shoulder. In the evenings, when the pain in her hands let her, she sat at the window of the rehabilitation block and watched the rain come down over a planet the Celt had not been allowed to take, and she hummed her mother's tune, 3 notes up and 2 notes down, the most ordinary tune in the galaxy. Fingers, the ruined fingers, twitched on her knee in the old shapes, playing along with a piano that wasn't there. On a planet her mother had never seen, in a war her mother could never have imagined. And somewhere far above the clouds, 40,000 people who would never know her name slept safe in their berths, rerouted, alive. She didn't play for them. She'd told the truth to the young officer about that. She didn't play for the big moment, or the medal, or the indomitable spirit of the species. She played for the next note, the way she always had, the way her mother had taught her, in the small hours of an impossible discipline, beside a bench on a world that was gone now, humming a tune that meant nothing and held everything together. The shake is just the music asking to get out, Mija. You let it out and it stops. Her hands stopped shaking. The rain came down. It fell and went on falling, the way rain does when there is no one left to stop it. And Mara Vance hummed her mother's tune into the gray ordinary evening and let the music out. All of it, every bit she'd been saving, until there was nothing left to save and nothing left to fear. And that, she understood at last, watching the rain finish every fall it started. That was the soul they'd said she didn't have. She'd had it the whole time. She'd just been waiting for a song worth burning it on.